If you've been following the PC industry even casually, you've probably heard the claim Lenovo is ditching Windows for Linux. That sounds dramatic, and, depending on how you interpret it, it could signal a real shift in how personal computing works. But this isn't just about one company changing software. It's about control. Who controls your device, your data, and your computing experience? And if the balance shifts, even slightly, it could reshape pricing, privacy, performance, and the entire PC ecosystem. For decades, Microsoft's operating system has been the default choice for most manufacturers. Companies like Lenovo, HP, Dell, they don't just sell hardware, they sell a package, and that package has almost always included Windows pre-installed. This relationship wasn't accidental. Microsoft built an ecosystem that made Windows the easiest choice for both manufacturers and users. It offered broad software compatibility, enterprise support, and a familiar interface that businesses relied on. From a manufacturer's perspective, preloading Windows simplified everything. Drivers were standardized, enterprise buyers expected it, and Microsoft's licensing deals made the economics workable. And from the user side, switching away from Windows often felt risky. Key software, especially in business, gaming, and productivity, was built around it. That created a powerful feedback loop. The more people used Windows, the more developers built for it, and the more software existed, the harder it became to leave. That's the foundation Microsoft's PC dominance rests on, and it's why even small changes in manufacturer behavior can attract so much attention. Lenovo has not abandoned Windows. It still sells a massive number of Windows-based PCs, especially in enterprise and consumer markets. Windows remains central to its business. What has changed is this. Lenovo has expanded its Linux offerings, particularly in its premium and enterprise-focused product lines. This includes pre-configured Linux systems, especially through partnerships with distributions like Ubuntu and Red Hat Enterprise Linux. These aren't experimental builds. They are certified, supported configurations designed for professional use. And that's important, because for years, Linux on laptops was often a workaround. Users installed it themselves, dealt with driver issues, and accepted limitations. Lenovo's shift changes that dynamic. Now you can buy a machine, out of the box, that is officially supported, tested, and optimized for Linux. That includes proper driver compatibility, firmware integration, and enterprise-grade support contracts. This is less about replacing Windows and more about legitimizing Linux as a first-class option in the PC market. So why is Lenovo doing this now? There are three major forces driving this move. Enterprise demand. Large organizations, especially in tech, finance, and engineering, have been increasing their use of Linux environments. Developers, data scientists, and cloud engineers often prefer Linux because it aligns more closely with server infrastructure. Most cloud platforms and backend systems already run on Linux. When employees use Linux on their local machines, it reduces friction. The tools behave consistently, environments match production systems, and workflows become more efficient. Lenovo is responding to that demand. It's not pushing Linux, it's supplying what enterprise buyers are already asking for. The rise of cloud and containers. Modern computing has shifted. Applications are no longer tied tightly to a specific operating system. Instead, they run in containers, virtual machines, or browser-based environments. This weakens one of Windows' biggest advantages, its software ecosystem lock-in. When your primary tools are cloud-based or containerized, the underlying OS becomes less critical. And in many of those environments, Linux is the default. Lenovo is aligning its hardware strategy with that reality. Cost and control considerations. Windows, licensing adds cost to every machine. For large deployments, that cost becomes significant. Linux, on the other hand, can be deployed without licensing fees, though enterprise support may still involve paid contracts. More importantly, Linux offers control. Organizations can customize it, secure it at a deeper level, and avoid reliance on a single vendor's roadmap. In an era where companies are increasingly sensitive to vendor lock-in, that matters. Yes, Lenovo expanding Linux support is meaningful, but no, it does not mean Microsoft's PC empire is collapsing. To understand why, you need to look at scale and dependency. Windows still dominates the desktop operating system market globally. Its presence in enterprise environments, especially in non-technical roles, remains overwhelming. Most businesses rely on Microsoft's broader ecosystem, Office, Active Directory teams, and other integrated services. Switching away from Windows isn't just changing an OS. It means rethinking workflows, retraining employees, and potentially replacing critical software. That's a massive barrier. So what Lenovo is doing doesn't dismantle Microsoft's position. It introduces optional competition in specific segments. Even if Windows remains dominant, Linux is gaining traction in targeted areas. Developer workstations. This is the most significant growth area. Developers often prefer Linux for its flexibility, package management, and compatibility with cloud-native tools. Pre-installed Linux systems remove friction and make adoption easier at scale. High-performance computing and AI Linux is already dominant in servers and supercomputers. As AI workloads grow, the same preference extends to local development environments. Hardware optimized for Linux becomes a natural fit. Security-sensitive environment. Some organizations prefer Linux because of its transparency and control over security configurations. While Windows has strong security features, Linux offers a different model, one that appeals to organizations with specific requirements. Despite these shifts, there are areas where Windows remains deeply entrenched. General consumer use. Most consumers still rely on Windows for familiarity, software availability, and ease of use. Switching to Linux often involves a learning curve that many users are not willing to take. Gaming. While Linux gaming has improved significantly, thanks to tools like Proton, Windows still provides the broadest compatibility and performance consistency. For many users, that alone is enough to stay. Enterprise productivity tools like Microsoft Office, especially in enterprise deployments, are tightly integrated with Windows environments. Although alternatives exist, the switching cost is high. Microsoft isn't unaware of these trends. In fact, many of its recent moves suggest it's adapting rather than resisting. The company has embraced Linux in several ways, integrating it into Windows through the Windows subsystem for Linux, supporting open source projects, and building cloud infrastructure that heavily relies on Linux systems. Azure, Microsoft's cloud platform, runs a large portion of its workloads on Linux. This reflects a broader strategy shift. Microsoft is no longer solely dependent on Windows as its core business driver. Instead, it's focusing on services, cloud infrastructure, and cross-platform tools. So while Lenovo expanding Linux support introduces competitive pressure, it doesn't directly undermine Microsoft's overall business model. There's another layer to this shift that doesn't get as much attention, but it's critical if you're trying to understand where things are heading. This isn't just about operating systems, it's about who controls the computing stack. Traditionally, Microsoft controlled a large portion of that stack on PCs, from the operating system to productivity tools, enterprise, infrastructure. That level of control created consistency, but it also created dependency. Now, that structure is being gradually broken apart. With Linux, organizations gain the ability to separate hardware from software decisions. They can choose Lenovo for hardware, a Linux distribution for the OS, and entirely different vendors for productivity, cloud, and security tools. That modular approach reduces reliance on any single company. And while that might not seem dramatic in the short term, it has long-term implications. Because once companies start designing their systems this way, switching components becomes easier over time. Lenovo's move could also influence how PCs are designed going forward. When hardware is built with Linux in mind from the start, priorities can shift. Manufacturers may focus more on open driver support, firmware transparency, and compatibility with a wider range of software environments. This could lead to systems that are less tied to one ecosystem and more adaptable overall. It also creates pressure on other manufacturers. If Lenovo successfully builds demand for Linux-ready machines, competitors like HP and Dell may expand their own offerings to match. That kind of competition doesn't replace Windows, but it reduces its exclusivity. There's also a geopolitical and regulatory dimension to consider. Some governments and public institutions have shown interest in reducing dependence on foreign software vendors, especially in sensitive sectors. Linux, being open source, offers a level of transparency and auditability that proprietary systems cannot fully match. While large-scale government transitions are complex and slow, even partial adoption can influence market demand. If public sector buyers begin specifying Linux compatibility in procurement contracts, manufacturers will respond. And companies like Lenovo are positioning themselves to meet that requirement if it grows. When you put all of this together, the picture becomes clearer. This isn't a sudden disruption where Windows disappears from PCs. It's a gradual rebalancing of power. Windows remains dominant, but alternatives are becoming more viable, more accessible, and more strategically important. And once viable alternatives exist at scale, the dynamics of the market change, even if the majority of users don't switch immediately. That's the part that often gets overlooked. The shift doesn't need to be massive to matter. It just needs to be real. From a practical perspective, this shift gives you more choice. If you're a developer or someone working with cloud tools, buying a Linux-ready machine becomes easier and more reliable. If you're a general user, nothing changes immediately. Windows remains widely available and supported. But over time, increased competition can influence pricing, performance optimization, and even privacy features. When manufacturers and software providers compete more directly, users tend to benefit. Here's a grounded way to think about the future. Imagine a workplace where different teams use different operating systems based on their needs. Developers use Linux machines, designers use Mac OS, administrative staff use Windows. This kind of environment is already emerging in some organizations. Lenovo's move supports that flexibility. It doesn't force a shift, it enables one. So is Microsoft's PC empire shaking? Not in the dramatic sense often suggested by headlines. But there is a gradual shift happening. The dominance of a single operating system is being replaced by a more diverse landscape. And in that landscape, control is distributed rather than centralized. That's a slower, more structural change, not a sudden collapse. Even if the impact isn't immediate, this moment is significant because it reflects a broader transition in computing. The operating system is becoming less of a gatekeeper and more of a layer, one part of a larger ecosystem that includes cloud services, cross-platform tools, and web-based applications. Lenovo's expansion into Linux-ready systems is one signal of that transition. It shows that manufacturers are preparing for a future where flexibility matters more than default choices. And while Windows isn't going anywhere, it's no longer the only path forward. That alone changes the conversation.